Every day, scientists are learning more and more about how human brains work and how many of us don't fit into the old-fashioned understanding of how brains should work. But a lot of ideas about parenting and familial relationships still need to catch up to the reality of human variation. Neurological differences are natural, profoundly valuable parts of being in a community together and in being part of a family. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your journey, I am here to explore with you. We are all in this together. Welcome to Neurodiverging. Hello friends, welcome back to Neurodiverging. Danielle here. Today we are continuing our discussion on the history of ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. We've talked some about how we have good evidence that ADHD is a normal neurodivergence. The presentation or traits of ADHD are due to genetic variation, and they've been present in the human population for thousands of years that we know of, and probably longer throughout prehistory. So in the last episode of the series, I discussed the obtuse man, who was a Greek caricature of an ADHD-seeming person from the 3rd century CE. Then we talked briefly about the idea through the late 18th century in the West that ADHD, along with other neurodivergences and mental health challenges, was considered a sign of moral deficit. That is, if you had ADHD traits, you must have done something bad to earn them, quote unquote. Finally, in the early 1800s, a physician called Crichton published a series of volumes that began to call this into question. Crichton suggested that mental illness and neurodivergences as well were based in physiology, and he was the first person to have any traction with this theory. So today we're going to spend more time in the early modern era, working from the 1850s through the 1980s. Again, this is not meant to be a thorough exploration. There are many, many books out there, and I have some resources listed in the show notes if you'd like to explore further. Those are available at neurodiverging.com. But this is just an overview so that when you hear someone say ADHD, you have some idea of the historical and cultural context behind it. So as I said, if you're interested in more information on ADHD, autism, other neurodivergences, now and throughout history, please subscribe to this podcast and go check out the website at neurodiverging.com. So once Crichton introduces this idea that neurodivergence and mental illness are not related to sin or moral character, but are rather physiological in nature, we see several other prominent physicians start to jump on the bandwagon. In 1844, almost 50 years after Crichton published his books, the German physician Heinrich Hoffmann, who later went on to found the first mental hospital in Frankfurt, created some illustrated children's stories, including Fidgety Phil, Philip, who is nowadays a popular allegory for ADHD. Like Crichton, Hoffmann rejected the common opinion that psychiatric patients were obsessed or criminal. Instead, he saw mental illness and neurodivergence as medical issues stemming from something in the physical body. Hoffmann wrote a children's book called Struwwelpeter, which he had created for his 3-year-old son, Carl Philipp, who may or may not have been his inspiration for the stories. The poem Philip or Fidgety Philip, probably the first written mention of something that looks very much like ADHD by a medical professional. In the story, the father asks his son to sit at the dinner table and be calm and eat. But the son is not able to sit still. He rocks back and forth on his chair until he loses his balance, taking the tablecloth and all of the dinner down with him. As a parent of a child with ADHD, this story was pretty familiar to me. Maybe it is familiar to you as well. So despite being the first medical professional to describe ADHD and being progressive in his treatment of mental illnesses for the time, Hoffmann's depiction of ADHD in Philip still focuses blame on the child. And although Philip gets off relatively lightly, the children in the other stories in the collection fare much worse. The stories were very popular at the time, though, to the point that Philip is still used today in German-speaking countries to refer to a child who fidgets, is restless, or constantly on the move. Hoffman's fidgety Phil was important for being the first time a medical professional described ADHD, but it's sort of an incidental description, being more prescriptive for how children should and should not behave. Most historians seem to consider the real scientific starting point in the history of ADHD to be the Galstonian lectures of Sir George Frederick Still in 1902, about 60 years after Hoffman. The Galstonian lectures on some abnormal psychical conditions in children, long name, were presented before the Royal College of Physicians in London in March 1902, and then released by the Lancet, a very popular magazine, in April that year. Still described a group of 20 children he'd encountered in his pediatric practice who were defiant, extremely emotional, chaotic, spiteful, and who didn't seem able to control themselves. He noted they had been raised in good homes to decent parents, but that this behavior still appeared early on in their lives. In his address, Still discusses this group as having, quote, an abnormal defect of moral control, end quote, which he refers to as morbid, which means diseased. Still asked several questions of his audience in this lecture series, which basically boiled down to, does this set of symptoms together make a thing? And if this is a thing, is this set of symptoms I'm seeing caused by some underlying condition, or is it something that exists on its own, unrelated to any co-occurring medical issues? So Still has seen a collection of symptoms which we would now say would indicate possible ADHD. And he was the first medical professional to really notice this constellation of symptoms and consider whether it was something on its own as opposed to co-occurring symptoms from another underlying disease. So now Still described the set of behaviors he observed in his pediatric practice as being, quote, defects of moral control, where moral control was defined as the control of action in conformity with the idea of the good of all. One of Still's overall categories of moral deficiency is basically mischievousness or misbehavior, children who repeatedly do things they're not supposed to do, even if a parent or another adult warns them against it. We know, of course, that many children labeled troublemakers nowadays commonly struggle with impulsivity. To anyone with an impulsive child or who experiences impulsivity themselves, all of Still's examples will be very familiar. Still's work is important to the history of ADHD because he is the first doctor to recognize a collection of traits, now known as ADHD, as being related to each other, and one of the first medical professionals to say that ADHD was likely biological in origin. That said, most of his conjectures as to the nature of the relationship were flat out wrong. With his theory of defect of moral control, he's referring to a group of children as being disinterested in the good of the community and more interested in their own goals and pursuits. Although this is true to some extent in most children, I would hazard to say, he's kind of calling these kids selfish at the root of it. And in a lot of his lecture, he seems to view them as almost malevolent, doing bad things on purpose just to be bad. Most of Still's work is deeply ableist from our modern perspectives, and it's not fun to read for that reason. That said, it is still possible to recognize that overall, the group of kids he's talking about do seem to have traits of what we'd now call ADHD, and this is the first time a physician called that out. Additionally, the realization that these ADHD traits were biological in origin, as opposed to mental or psychological, also created the beginnings of the realization that punishing kids for these behaviors wouldn't fix them. Recognizing that clinical treatment was needed was the beginning of creating a better, kinder type of child rearing. So Still's work really caught on, and after his 1902 lecture, there's a spurt of activity around figuring out the biological mechanisms of ADHD. For example, William James, the father of American psychology, read Still's work and was very intrigued. James believed that the deficits in what he called inhibitory volition, moral control, and sustained attention were somehow caused by an underlying neurological defect or difference in the brain. He thought ADHD brains might have a decreased threshold for inhibition of response to various stimuli, or that there might be some disconnection within the cortex of the brain where intelligence was disassociated from willpower. James's work added to the growing idea that ADHD was biological, not psychological, in nature. And then, in 1936, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved benzedrine as a medicine. Benzedrine was the first amphetamine marketed in the United States to treat conditions like depression. In 1937, Dr. Charles Brady was trialing Benzedrine for behaviorally disordered kids who had severe headaches when he accidentally learned that his patients' behavior and performance in school improved when he gave this drug to them. This discovery was not well understood at the time because doctors didn't get why a stimulant would improve these behavioral symptoms. But throughout the 1940s and 50s, these kids were sometimes treated with benzidine, as well as two other stimulants called Ritalin and Xylar. It's in the 1950s that we start to see the use of hyperkinetic emotionally disturbed children and hyperkinetic impulse disorder as diagnoses. Which diagnosis was used seems to have depended largely on the doctor and the primary trait of concern. In the 1960s, minimally brain damaged became the popular way to refer to kids who had various combinations of impairment in perception, conceptualization, language, memory, and control of attention, impulse, or motor function. All of these diagnoses probably lump together folks that we would distinguish between today, but scientists and doctors were starting to zoom in on ADHD and its specificities. All of these issues are still considered childhood problems, though. There's hardly any research done in this time period on what happens to children like this as adults. Many of them were probably institutionalized. Now, let me take a minute to mention the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, which is still the major publication used to diagnose neurodivergence and mental health issues today. The first edition was published by the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, in 1952, but it didn't include any mention of any of these earlier terms for ADHD. But in 1968, the second edition comes out, and that finally includes the disorders hyperkinetic reaction of childhood or adolescence and organic brain syndrome. That's my favorite one. So the medical establishment has recognized these disorders and is beginning to codify how they should be diagnosed and treated. The year after that, in 1969, the first Conners rating scale is published by C. Keith Conners. Revised editions of this questionnaire are still used to help diagnose ADHD today for kids between 6 and 18 years old. So by the late 1960s and early 1970s, there's been enough research completed and enough consensus in the medical community about what's going on that Conners is able to pull together a resource that is still in use 50 years later. Now, in the 1970s, there begins to be a pretty significant backlash to ADHD, and especially treatment of ADHD with stimulant medications. This is due mostly to one newspaper article in the Washington Post, which drastically misrepresented the number of kids in the U.S. public school system being given stimulants, and also incorrectly implied that parents were being coerced into drugging their kids by the school systems. This article did so much damage and is still doing damage today as we continue to fight the effects of misinformation published 50 years ago. This is important to the ADHD timeline, though, because this one article is where a lot of misperceptions about ADHD come from to this day, especially the idea that ADHD was created by the drug companies to sell stimulants. Fueled by the bad statistics in that article, a lot of anti-ADHD books came out in the 1970s, and a lot of them pushed quote-unquote facts that have now been disproven, like the idea that ADHD isn't a real thing, or that if it is, then it's just that food dyes cause hyperactivity, or sugar causes hyperactivity, or parents just aren't parenting hard enough, etc. These books are direct ancestors of modern-day TV causes ADHD, video games cause ADHD, gluten causes ADHD hysteria, and they continue to cloud and mask the real biological causes of attention differences. I want to make a quick clarifying note here. You may personally find that food dyes or gluten or TV or whatever affects your ADHD. That's great. I'm not here to invalidate your experience, and I think that there probably are a small number of people who are able to control their ADHD by changing their diet or their electronic habits or whatever. We have research to support that as truth. But study after study has looked at this in groups, and the vast majority of ADHD folks are not affected overmuch by sugar or food dyes or gluten or electronics, etc. I believe that pretending that they are just shames folks who are struggling instead of offering real support. So if it works for you, awesome. That doesn't mean it's going to work for other folks. Anyway, this anti-ADHD backlash pushes the American Academy of Pediatrics to publish their first statement about ADHD in 1975 called Medication for Hyperkinetic Children. So I'm not going to read you this statement in full, but it's only about a page long, and I'll put a link in the show notes if you are interested in reading it. It's pretty straightforward, but there are some things we can learn from it. First, the American Academy of Pediatrics is recommending medication only when necessary and not as a first step. Second, the AAP is straightforward about the fact that the mechanism by which the drugs work and how to tell which drug to try when is not well understood at this time, and so drugs need to be used carefully and with oversight and prescribed by an actual doctor who's done a full diagnosis of the child in question. And finally, the AAP recognizes that what looks like hyperkinetic child syndrome might also be an expression of basic personality, anxiety, subclinical seizure disorders, strictly in the eyes of the beholder, or true hyperkinesis, because the method of diagnosis is not yet particularly objective or trustworthy, so the doctor needs to be keeping an eye on the results of any drug trial. So finally, in 1980, we hear the words attention deficit disorder for the first time when the DSM-3 is published. The DSM includes the subtypes ADD with hyperactivity, ADD without hyperactivity, and ADD residual type. So this is the evolution in the understanding of ADHD from the 1800s through the beginning of the 1980s, when we finally get ADD in the Diagnostic manual. We see the movement away from the model of ADHD being purely mental or psychological and into the idea of ADHD as being caused by biological mechanisms. With this comes the understanding of a need for clinical diagnosis and treatment protocols, as what ADHD really is clarifies. In the near future, I'll have a final episode covering the most recent history of ADHD from the 1980s through today. In the meantime, please do check out neurodiverging.com for some other articles on the history of ADHD, parenting a child with autism or ADHD, or working with a partner with ADHD. Next week, we'll be switching topics and doing an audience-requested episode about how I grew up with undiagnosed autism in the 1990s and what that was like. So come back next week for that one and hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And please remember, progress comes as we learn more about who we are. We are all in this together.